Hello and welcome back to CleaveTech Tech Tips. And if you haven't watched a tech tip before, welcome new viewer. Now I've been working on this old 1/32 Slotstox car for quite a while now, and I think in this episode we're going to finish putting it together. Yay, you say? This has been going on for a long time, and believe me, I'm saying yay too. So let's get on with it. Well, at the end of the last episode, I managed to get a nice gear mesh on the chassis and I got the motor in and got it revving up nicely. If you haven't seen that, I'll put a link on the screen now. But today we're going to get the front axle on so that the chassis will sit nicely on the block and be the right clearance at the front. And we're going to get this top chassis here, going to get it attached to the chassis at the front, or in a way that we can easily remove it. Get the guide and the lead wires on too. So in order to get this front axle in the right place and the right height and keep the clearance under the car, I checked the rules, and the rules say that you actually just need ground clearance. They don't actually specify an amount. But bearing in mind the tracks are quite bumpy sometimes, I'm going to give it about 1 mil ground clearance at the front, 1 millimetre. This ruler here that I put on the block is about 1 millimetre thick, so I've rested the front of the chassis on that. And I'm just going to use a piece of piano wire at the back of the chassis like that. Put that underneath it, just to bring the chassis up to a similar height at the rear, just because obviously the front wheels are going to solder on sort of somewhere in between the two, about here. So I can lift up the top chassis because it's only held on at the back through those two little loops. Again, I showed you those in a previous video, but you can have a look at all my other Slotstox videos here. I'll put a link on the screen and you can go through the build right from the start if you want. So the bottom chassis is held up off the deck or off this block by this 1 millimetre bit here and this piano wire at the back there. Then I need to make sure that my front wheels are outside of the bumpers. The bumpers and the side rails can't come outside of the front wheels. Now, as this was top chassis, this one here with the body shell on, was previously built, and this is the one that the customer would like to use, then I need to stick with this design. So I'm going to make sure that the front wheels sit just fractionally clear of the straight line between there and there, and make sure it sticks out just that little bit extra that it needs to do just to match the rules. So the front axle is more or less in position. You can see it's going to line up nicely with that bracket that I soldered onto the bottom chassis, that sort of U-shaped bracket there. So I'm going to get everything in position. I'm going to hold it together, and then I'm just going to tack it in position in a couple of places before I flow the solder along the whole axle. So my soldering iron is nice and hot. It's about 450 degrees C. I'm going to put a little bit of flux at each of those ends there by the front axle. I'm going to put a little bit of solder on the end of the soldering iron, and I'm just going to tack that front wheel in place just there, like that on that side. Put a little bit more solder on the soldering iron, and I will tack it in place again on the other side, like that. So at the moment, the quick way to remove the back of the top chassis is to loosen the gear. So loosen the grub screw on the gear, which you can do through the back there, and then the axle will just slide out. Now I don't want to slide it all the way out because I don't want to lose all my spacers, but I can slide it out of that side, push it back through there, and then slide it out of that side, and then we have it top chassis off. So I haven't cleaned anything up, but there's the front axle soldered on to the chassis. But you can see it's only just soldered on along here. Any big sort of knocks and bumps on the axle could very well fracture this joint. So I need to reinforce this joint. Now that's a little bit harder to do with tube, but I could do it with braid clip like I've used on here and wrap some braid clip round it. But I'm going to do it in a different way. It's probably a little better and slightly easier to do for a joint like this. So here I have some quite thin single core wire. This wire is, say, 0.5 millimetre thick or 0.5 millimetre diameter, and I'm going to use this wire to wrap around the axle at both ends to reinforce that joint. But before I do that, I'm going to add the part of the chassis that mounts to the top chassis. So here's the top chassis. You can see the back of it mounts around the axle at the rear here, and the front of it has these little two tubes soldered to the chassis. Now I've bent up this little C-shape or U-shaped bracket that's going to sit inside those tubes, and it gives a little bit of motion there, a little bit of movement inside those tubes like that, so that the top chassis can actually sort of move around a little bit and is not rigidly fixed to the bottom chassis. But what I do need to do is solder this bracket here to where the front axle mounts. So I've set it all up ready to solder. You can see I've used a little bit of tube here, and it's supporting the top chassis and getting the bumper height exactly right. The bumper has to have a contact point that is 13 millimeters high from the track surface. So I've used a little bit of tube here to space that bumper up and for the whole of the top chassis to rest on it, and then that holds that at the right height. That little C bracket is in there that's going to hold the top chassis up, and I'm going to tack it in place up the edges of the front axle again without heating it too much and ruining the front axle position. I've also supported the back of the chassis just a little bit again with my piece of piano wire there, just to keep the whole thing straight so I know I'm measuring the correct bumper height. So let's get a little bit of flux on that and get that soldered into position. So there we go. You can see how it moves around at the front in these two little tubes there and there. There we go. So you can see there's a little bit of float and a little bit of movement, but it can't actually come off because it's held on by the back axle. So again, I should be able to remove it just by lifting that up, slide the back axle out that way and lift that up, and then that should just slide forward, and there we are. We've removed the top chassis. So we're going to get back to reinforcing this joint. Now I'm going to use this single core wire to wrap around and reinforce both this front axle joint to the bracket and the top chassis mount to the bracket and the front axle at the same time. So a little bit of flux on that, a little bit of flux on the end of the wire. Make sure I've got a little bit of solder on the end of the wire, and I should be able to bring them both together, heat that up like so, not too much, like that, and then the wire is now soldered onto there, and I'm going to wrap it around a few times as tight as I can to reinforce all of that joint. So you can see I've wrapped the wire around that joint. I've done 6 wraps around on that side. I haven't soldered anything else in position. I only tacked it at the first end of the wire, but I'm now going to put some flux on this, heat it up, and let solder flow all the way around that wire, and then that'll act as a really nice bracing for this joint right on the end of the axle. And then I'm going to do the same the other side.
A few inches later.
There you have it. So there's 6 coils there, 6 coils there, 6 coils there, 6 coils there, all wrapped around nicely to brace both this top chassis front mount and the axle all to this bracket here that's braced with the lead wire clips. So hopefully that should be nice and strong and be able to withstand all the bash and crash that you're likely to get in a Slotstox race. Now next up is the guide and the lead wires, and mounting that on to get them spaced correctly. Now you might notice this has got sort of something coloured in on it. Well, this is a very special guide, and I'm going to explain more in a minute. You can see it's a Mid-America guide. Now these are really tough, really strong. They can withstand lots of bashes and crashes, and you can see the plastic is quite thick on the guide as well. So this is going to be an absolutely ideal guide to use on the Slotstox. Now you might be wondering, as I say, what this is for. Well, in this guide, this is filled with tungsten weights. So the guide itself is really heavy. And the great thing about this is it's really heavy right at the front of the car, where if you have bashes and crashes, obviously the guide keeps the car in the slot. So the heavier the guide, the better. So instead of piling loads and loads of weight onto the drop arm of the chassis, then why don't we make the guide much heavier, and then that'll help keep it in the slot. So as I say, a very special guide that's going to help the handling and help this car stay in the slot in the races. So let's start preparing this guide. I'm only going to go through it really quickly because I've already done a video on preparing guides and braids, etc. So have a look in the top right hand corner. I'll put a link to that video about preparing a guide and braids. But I've already got my guide clips or my lead wire clips here ready. I've got my 2 braids ready. That's the old one. That was one of the ones that was in the guide previously, but it looks perfectly serviceable. This is a brand new one that I've managed to find of the same type. They're quite hard braids because they're going to get used in, as I say, lots of crashing and bashing, and if the braid is too soft it just all rips apart basically on the track. So I prepared my braids a little bit by flattening them out to the same thickness. I've cut off the little bit of the braid here, braid clip that folds over so it doesn't go over onto the braid, so that when the braid folds over it doesn't cut the braid in half. And I'm just about to flatten out this little pimple in the clip as well, and then I'm going to push it all together. So braids are pushed into the guide. I've flattened the guide out on the bottom, as you can see, like that. Now it's time to round off all of these edges so that in an accident nothing or things are less likely to dig in and more likely to deflect off. So I'm going to use my little battery rotary tool for this job. These are absolutely brilliant. I found a friend of mine had one of these at a recent race I went to, and I had a look online and found them on Amazon, and they're really cheap, but they're really good. So I'll put a link in the video description down below of where you can get these from. In the UK anyway, definitely. I'll have a look for a link for other countries. But they're absolutely great. They're so small and so light, and they're great to take away to flyaway events, for example, because you can take 2 or 3 of them, and they're really, really light. I know I still like my Proxon because it's much more powerful, but these are pretty much good enough to cut guides, polish guides, cut axles, trim bits and pieces, polish bits and pieces. They're great for that. I probably wouldn't use them to cut chassis out with or cut really thick pieces of metal, but they're pretty good for most things. So I'm going to start rounding off this guide now, and I've got a little polishing tool in my Dremel, and I'm just going to go over the edges like this, around, and I'm going to keep polishing, and I'll be back in a moment.
12 seconds later.
So there we have it. The guide is all rounded off and radiused off here. Not too much because you don't want to weaken the guide too much, but it's all radiused off on that top surface to deflect anything that tends to hit it above. You can see I've also radiused this front corner. I wouldn't normally do that on guides, but the rules of the MSRA say you have to have a radius on the bottom corner of the guide. I assume that's to help with getting over bumps on the track and alignments of the sections, etc. So you have to have that as part of the rules. So I've done that. So there we have it. The guide is assembled. We have the braids in place on the guide. The guide turns to quite a nice angle so you can get really sideways round the corners without popping the guide. It moves nicely. You can see I've put this brass guide nut on. Now that's actually a Samson guide nut. You can get them from various manufacturers, but I think they're really nice. You need a special tool, or well, you could do it with a pair of long nose pliers, undo it and do it up, but there is a special tool that goes with it. It's not too expensive. It comes with 2 little prongs. Looks a little bit like this. So it's like a guide tool, but 2 little prongs that go in there. And in fact, other manufacturers have copied this design, changed it a little bit, but they've copied that basic design because they thought it was so good to use these rather than try and get a wrench or a socket over the top of the guide on a conventional guide nut. So that's the guide in place. You notice I've put a couple of washers underneath it there, and you'll see why in a moment. So if I turn the car sideways, I've put these rear tyres on just literally so you can see the spacing and the clearance under the car. But if I hold the car there like that, you can see there's a fraction of a spring in the guide there. The chassis, it's just, you can see the pan's moving a little bit. That's just because I've got it sort of held up in the air here by the side of the camera. But you can see there's a spring there in the guide, just a fraction, just to take up any of the bumps in the track, etc. If you remember before, I said that sometimes they're on copper tape and the joints of the tape are not great. So if the guide was really hard on the track, as you went down the track and you went over the bumps, it would tend to lift all the front axle up and so on over the bumps. So you want a little bit of springiness in the guide to take that up. And then you can see that in an accident, you've got the movement of the drop arm like this, that the front wheels can hit things and go up bumps and the guide still stays in place. So the next thing I have to do is get a set of lead wires between here and here. So before I actually put the lead wires on, I thought I would show you the lead wire dilemma that we have on Slotstox cars. You can see the guide turns a fair amount, and we've got this bumper in the way, we've got a front axle in the way, and the rules say obviously this top chassis has to be above the axle, so I can't sort of like, you know, make the axle higher or the top chassis go round the bottom. There's various things you can't do in the rules, so the lead wires sort of have to go through this gap here. And with the stop for the drop arm and things like that as well, you know, there's quite a bit to do. There's quite a small space for the lead wires to go through. So big chunky lead wires are difficult. Also, if you loop the lead wires, which I've seen some people do sort of over the top like this and through the top chassis, then if you ever wanted to remove the top chassis, you have to desolder lead wires or unclip lead wires, and that's a bit of a pain in the neck as well. So it's a little bit tricky to get lead wires through that gap. So I'm going to show you the solution. So what I'm going to be using is this quite thin wire. Now these 16D motors, they don't draw a lot of amps, and the wiring on the tracks are not normally great anyway, so I'm not too worried about over a really short length of wire, which is all we're talking about between the guide and the motor. I'm not really concerned about too much voltage drop along this wire. And as I say, they're not running, you know, 2-3 amps of current, you know, continuously through the wire. It's only maybe the odd pulse at that level. So this wire is perfectly capable of handling the current and lack of voltage drop needed to run these cars. So this being quite a small diameter wire, it's going to be great and fit through those small gaps.
A little longer than a few minutes later.
So here is my solution for the lead wires. They're all done. So they're soldered onto here, onto the guide here, nice and neatly. Come back, they loop, and then they go over the loop and then down to the motor. And the same the other side. That way, there's plenty of room in there for the drop arm to move. The wires are not too stiff, they're not stopping the guide from turning, they're not jamming anything. And the guide more or less self-centers, not too bad there. And this insulation on here, this silicone insulation, is actually really good on the wire and it's really strong. But I'm just going to make one final tweak just to make sure that the wires stay intact in an accident. So there we have it, the final tweak over the guide. So I've put some glue gun glue just over the top of the wires and where they solder onto the guide, just to make sure that there's no chance that those wires can get ripped off in an accident, especially as the guide sticks way out the front of the car. So hopefully that'll do the job. I thought about using some epoxy, but when you use some epoxy, it can be really hard to remove it afterwards. At least with this, you can just heat up and heat through it and get the wires out if you have to replace them. So hopefully that'll all work really nicely. So there we have it. I've just trimmed the guide post down. I put the top chassis back on just so you can see how it sits on the car, how it clears the lead wires and not in the way at all. So the top chassis's got a bit of float and a bit of movement. We've got nice rotation to back wheels and front wheels. The guide is there nicely. We've got the movable weight so that this will move in the event of an accident and keep the front hard down. And the next thing to do will be to actually do the final setup and applying of the lead and the weight on the car. But we might save that for next time. Well, thank you very much for watching this video on me finishing off the Slotstox. So the next video is just going to be about the final setup of the Slotstox and getting some little setup tips about how to make them work better on the track. So that's one worth waiting for next week. And I'll see you again soon. Please subscribe. Please hit the big C here. And have a look at some of my other videos. Hit the thumbs up would be lovely, just underneath the video. And so read the video description, because again there's some links in there of where I get some of the parts from. Thank you very much. See you again next week. Bye.